Thank you. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you very much to Holly for inviting me. It's been a fantastic conference so far, and so it's really a real privilege to be able to contribute to it. I'm going to start in a perhaps surprising place and away from autism altogether, in fact. It's something that if you did Psychology 101, you might remember this experiment. So these stimuli here are a take on Solomon Asch's very famous experiment that he conducted back in the 1950s, where he gave participants a perceptual matching task. That is, he asked them to judge which of those three lines, in this case snakes, matched the one on your left. And for those of you who don't know this at all, but he presented the task not just with the participant on their own. He presented the task in the context of other participants. In fact, the other participants were confederates, or fake participants, who kind of were there to shake things up a bit. So he got people in a room, and he had the confederates, or the fake participants, in the room, and he asked them to say aloud which of those three snakes on the right matched the one on the left. And they went around the room and they said aloud what their responses. And finally, they got to the real participant, who then also had to articulate their own response. And what he found was that upon hearing other people's responses to this otherwise very simple question, the real participant often modified their response on the basis of what the other people thought. That is, they ended up saying that rather than the line looking like number one, it actually looked like number 2 or 3, which is really, really hard to see that you'd say that, but people did. And the point of this experiment was to show how deeply worrying people's tendency to conform is. So much so that they even get a very simple task like this wrong when they're influenced by other people. And this was coming back on the back of the Second World War, and this made psychologists deeply worried about how easy it is to influence people. So now if we zoom forward 50 years or so, some people had the very same interesting idea to do experiments like this with autistic children. And in an important study, children on the autism spectrum were given Asch's experiments. In fact, they were given the snakes rather than the lines, and asked to match the lengths of the snakes. So rather fascinatingly, the children on the autism spectrum seemed not to be as led astray by the information from confederates. So they were more likely to get the length of the snakes actually right to resist the pressure of social conformity. And so when I first read that paper, I was like, I thought about what Solomon Asch might have made of it. Surely he would have been delighted that there were people out there that actually get it right, that aren't led to the wrong answer because of peer pressure. Imagine my amazement then that when I started hearing people talk about this experiment and what the study had found, including colleagues that I really like and admire, had started to say that it was the autistic people who were somehow weird for getting the judgment right, rather than everyone else that was weird for getting the judgment wrong. And I've heard it again and again, and it's not just with this experiment, it was loads of other experiments, and it's also in my own earlier work, so I'm guilty of this too, where the response that characterises the autistic people is somehow labelled wrong, even when it's right. And I think this tells us a lot about researchers' attitudes towards autism, and this tendency to take the non-autistic perspective as the norm. And this is what I want to talk to you about today. So in my talk, I want to talk about whether the attitudes I've just been referring to stop us from doing our research and practice well, and some ways we might go about shifting it. So I want to consider 3 questions. The first is, what attitudes shape autism research, or who gets to decide what gets researched? And some of this will build on what Paul talked about yesterday in terms of priorities for research. The second question is, who gets to decide the terms we use to talk about autism? And the third is, who gets to decide the kind of practices that are used to intervene with autistic people? And we've already heard some brilliant case examples from this morning on this issue. So to start, the first question, who gets to decide what gets researched? Well, let's start with the good news. In the past decade, there's been a huge explosion in autism research. And this graph comes from the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, the National Institute of Health here in the US. And on the vertical axis is number of publications in peer-reviewed journals. And on the horizontal axis is time. So it's 1980 to 2010. And what I want you to focus on is the blue line. And as you see, you can see that kind of goes up. So if we start at 1980, there are about 240 autism-related publications every year. If we zoom forward to 2010, that increases to about 2,500. And the recent figure that Paul showed yesterday in 2015, it was up to 4,000 papers every year. So there's been this massive growth in autism research, particularly over the last decade. And this growth far surpasses that in other related areas. So the orange line that you can see reflects publications in related areas like pediatrics, child psychiatry, and child psychology. There's a tiny bit of growth there, but it's nothing like autism research. So there's a lot of autism research going on, which, if put into practice, has the potential to transform the lives of autistic people and their families. But I think, if we've heard already yesterday and today, the opportunities and life chances of autistic people are severely limited to those compared to non-autistic people. Autistic people are less likely to have a well-paid job or a job at all. Many have problems in their social lives, and many also struggle with their emotional, physical, and material well-being. So the question is this, all of the research going on, is it actually making a difference? It doesn't seem like it is. To get our heads around why there might be such a mismatch between all that research going on and why autistic people and their families don't really feel as if much is getting better, Tony Charman and I did at UCL a large study looking at what kind of research gets funded in the UK. In particular, we looked at the amount of money that was going towards autism research in the period between 2007 and 2011, so 5 years, and in particular, what areas it was invested. We found that across that 5-year period, there was £20.8 million devoted to autism research, spread across 106 different projects. And so in order to know which kind of areas those projects were targeting, we classified each of those 106 projects according to this rather scary diagram here, which I will explain. So there were 6 categories. I just want you to focus on the hexagons. You don't need to read anything in the coloured boxes. But we classified those projects according to whether they were on diagnosis and screening, early signs and biomarkers, whether they were on biology, brain, and cognition, whether they were on causes, and that could be environmental causes, genetic causes, the interaction between the two, whether they were on treatments and interventions, and that could include the whole gamut of interventions, so behavioural interventions to drug trials, whether they focused on services, so that included service delivery, but also training of professionals, educators, clinicians. And finally, so this particular classification system we kind of took from the NIH or the IACC classification system, but we added, or we slightly changed, to include societal issues, which included what Paul talked about yesterday, lifespan issues. We expanded this a little bit to think about kind of social and ethical issues, the kind of things we've been talking about in the last 2 days, but also biographical work, ethnobiographical work, research policy, and the economics of autism. So essentially, we categorised all of those 106 projects according to this classification system. You might already know the answer for this, given that if you listened carefully to Paul's talk yesterday. But I just want to give you 10 seconds to think about which area you think attracted the most money. So put your hands up, and it's okay if you get this wrong. Does anyone think diagnosis? Biology, brain, cognition? Causes? Yeah. Treatments and interventions? Yeah. Services? yeah. Societal issues? Yeah, definitely not. Okay, so this is what we found. I mean, this is UK, in the UK. So essentially you were all right, so you were listening to Paul's talk yesterday. So essentially what we found, if we join biology, brain and cognition and causes together, the majority of research that was being funded in the UK over that 5-year period went towards understanding the underlying biology and causes of autism. Only 5% went towards identifying effective services for autistic people and their families, and only 1% went towards understanding the place of autism in society or societal issues. We also did the same thing for publications. We had research assistants who categorised thousands of autism publications, and particularly for UK researchers, and basically we got quite a similar pattern. There's a preponderance of research understanding essential causes, rather than on services, societal issues, and interventions. And this is from data only from 2010, because this is the only data we could compare between US and UK. And so the UK is in the slightly lighter purple and the US in the darker purple. And what I hope you can see is that the US is actually a little bit more distributed across all those different, all those 6 categories. In the UK, we seem to have this spike in understanding biology, brain and cognition, and that's perhaps because we have a very strong tradition in neurocognitive research. But I hope you can see that both countries essentially devote very little resources to understanding societal or lifespan issues. So that's what's going on in current autism research, at least in the UK. But what does this say about the underlying attitudes towards autism and what actually matters for autistic people? So as part of this research, we then did a large-scale survey with autistic people, their family members, practitioners, which included clinicians and educators, as well as researchers. So there were 4 groups. And we asked people to rate the relative importance of 13 research questions. And these 13, rather than giving them people that scary diagram that I showed you, essentially we broke that down into those categories down into 13 different questions. And I don't necessarily expect you to read this, but so the questions were, are there different types of autism? How common is autism? How can we better recognize the signs and symptoms of autism? And so we asked people to rate the relative importance of these questions on a 5-point scale. 1 was like not so important, and 5 was really, really important. And what we found, again, you don't have to read the numbers, but essentially, a lot of the data was skewed, so in a positive way. So all 4 groups, so majority of our people responding, felt that all of these questions were pretty important. And that kind of reflects the fact we don't know enough about autism with regards to any of these issues. But there were 3 clear winners, so 3 top priorities. The first was, how can public services best meet the needs of autistic people? What are the best ways to improve the life skills of autistic people? And how do autistic people think and learn? This was across all 4 groups, so autistic people, parents, practitioners, and researchers. The only exception to this was autistic adults who also felt, what does the future hold for autistic adults? They rated that pretty important, which is perhaps unsurprising. And this is what people said. So one 28-year-old autistic woman said, we need to know how to work with the services to make sure everyone has a chance of having a better life. One mother said, we need to understand the most effective ways to educate autistic children and provide life skills while respecting them as individuals. A sister said, research needs to be carried out and put into ways to teach life skills and social rules to create more independence for adulthood. And mother said, I want to understand more about how my child sees the world so I can better understand his response to it. Importantly, it wasn't that people, because we did a lot of interviews and focus groups as well as the online survey, but it wasn't that people didn't value basic research or research into causes. They did value that, but they wanted more research on those areas that affect the day-to-day lives of autistic people and their families. So research on public services, life skills, cognition and learning, and the place of autistic people in society. This is in stark contrast to what is actually being researched by autism researchers across the world, apart from Paul. So what we've got here is a huge mismatch between what is being researched and what people want to be researched. So why is there a mismatch? Well, people had some things to say about this. So some autistic adults noted that the research being done represented neurotypical priorities regarding us, not autistic people's priorities. Others emphasised, particularly parents, that the research failed to speak to the reality in their lives in the here and now. So one mother said, you know, that's all researchers are interested in. What causes it, what causes it. It doesn't say much for the kids that have already got it, does it? So one reason for this mismatch is different attitudes towards autism research. Researchers were driven towards understanding causes, while autistic people and their families wanted research that focused on more immediate, practical concerns. A related reason for this mismatch between what is researched and what the autistic community want to be researched is the lack of involvement in research by members of the autistic community. So we asked, as part of the research study, we asked people how much they were involved in the research, not just as passive participants, but actually involved in the design, the implementation of the study, the analysis, the interpretation of the findings, or even the dissemination of the findings. We asked researchers how they, what their experiences were of involving the autistic community, and we also asked the parents and autistic adults and practitioners how much they felt like they were involved in the research they took part in. While the majority of researchers said that they frequently or very frequently engaged in public dissemination, talking about the research, and dialogue or like consulting with the autistic community, only a minority of autistic people, family members and practitioners shared their view. So researchers essentially perceived themselves to be pretty engaged with the autistic community, but the autistic community didn't really agree. All groups of respondents, however, agreed that active research partnership or co-production of research, where there's a more equal partnership in the research process, was a pretty rare occurrence. And when we asked people why there was a lack of community involvement in research, people talked about different attitudes. You know, one researcher said, the people making judgments about research and research funding have to be other scientists. And one practitioner said, I don't think many researchers feel that they can talk to autistic people as if they matter. They're too busy studying them like specimens or looking for a cure. And summing it up, one adult said to me in a focus group, autistic adult said to me in a focus group, rather skeptically, whatever we say, is it really going to influence anyone? So there was this real feeling of being disenfranchised, feeling really disempowered by research. So with this lack of involvement in research and lack of involvement in the decision-making processes around research, it's kind of not surprising to me that there's this mismatch between all the research that's going on and what people actually want from the research. So that's the first question. Who gets to decide what gets researched in autism? The second question that I want to move on to is something that I think reveals and shapes the attitudes towards autism perhaps even more profoundly. And that's the very terminology that we use as researchers, as clinicians, and in our everyday lives when we talk about autism. And I think there's no better place to start this discussion than by a very controversial autism awareness campaign by Autism Speaks a few years back. So I'll just play this for a little bit.
I am autism. I'm visible in your children, but if I can help it, I am invisible to you until it's too late. I know where you live, and guess what? I live there too. I hover around all of you. I know no color barrier, no religion, no morality, no currency. I speak your language fluently, and with every voice I take away, I acquire yet another language. I work very quickly. I work faster than pediatric AIDS, cancer, and diabetes combined. And if you are happily married, I will make sure that your marriage fails. Your money will fall into my hands, and I will...
Okay, I think we've got the picture. It goes on. So So you'll all have your own views about what you've just seen, but I think one thing's very clear is it doesn't present a very positive picture of autism, funded by one of the world's largest autism funding bodies. But here are some of the terms that we use to describe autism in our, in our everyday lives. We talk about a deficit, a disorder, a dysfunction, a weakness, a difference, a strength. We talk about high functioning, low functioning. We talk about a person with autism, a child with autism, an autistic person, someone who has Asperger's syndrome. Did I miss anything out? The autism spectrum. So we have a lot of words that we use to describe people which can be a bit confusing. And in my centre we see loads of parents and loads of autistic people who often ask, how should we talk about them or their child as autistic, as high functioning, as Asperger's or whatever. And this might seem a little bit trivial to some people, but actually it's a big deal. We're talking about their children, other people's children, young people, adults, and we don't really even have an agreed way of talking about them. So I'm going to talk about two rival ways that have been suggested to kind of cut through this confusion and finally settle on ways maybe to describe people. So number one is that in efforts to be inclusive, person-first language has become what's called for. So calling someone a person with autism, describing what a person has, not what a person is. And so in many countries, this has become the officially recommended way to speak about disability in the press, in journal articles, hospitals, and schools. So it's all about, I'm a person, not a disability. There is a second rival view, however. So many people, disabled people, have argued vehemently against the use of person-first language, instead preferring disability-first language or identity-first language, such as he or she is an autistic person or an autistic child. And Jim Sinclair, who's an autistic activist, argues that autistic people can never and should never be separated from their autism, both in life and in language. And Lydia Brown, who we've already heard about today, she argues, autism can be something to be positive about, even if it's always challenging. And so she gives an example in terms of language, where we tend to use adjectives that are positive tend to precede a noun rather than follow it. So we don't say a person with beauty, for example. We say a beautiful person. So people argue, why should we say a person with autism? We should say an autistic person. So there's two rival views. We wanted to know what the autistic community thought about these terminology issues. And so together with Lorcan Kenny, who's a doctoral student in my centre, and the UK's National Autistic Society, we asked more than 3,400 members of the UK autistic community, autistic adults, parents, practitioners, clinicians, researchers, about the terms they preferred to use and their reasons for doing so. So did they prefer to use autistic person, or person with autism, or person who has autism, etc. And perhaps unsurprisingly, it turned out that there was actually no term that was unanimously preferred across all groups, so there was no consensus. But there were distinct preferences from some of the groups. So in particular, autistic adults and parents preferred the term autistic. And these are the kinds of reasons they gave. So one autistic adult said, in describing someone who's autistic as a person with autism, a person who has autism, or worst of all, a person who suffers from autism, you imply that autism is separate from a person, and behind their autism is a normal person. And one parent said, autism is who and what and why these people are. You cannot separate these concepts. Clinicians and educators disagreed. So more professionals reported using person-first language, so person with autism, has Asperger's, than other disability-first terms. And these were some of the reasons they gave. I don't like phrases which describe a person as their condition, so would always go for person first, because that's what we all are, regardless of what conditions we have. I would never describe myself as a thyroidie, for example. And another practitioner said, we need to describe the individual and ASD as separate entities with the emphasis on the individual, not the disorder. So, what to do, given the lack of consensus? I think this is a huge challenge for all of us touched by autism. Take a second to think about what you do and why you do it. What would you say when a parent with a newly diagnosed child asks you how you should talk about their child or autism more broadly? So here's what I think as a result of doing the research. I think given the lack of agreement, I think we should always seek to establish how people wish to be described by asking them directly if that's possible, and not imposing external views or guidelines upon them. And I think surely it's not too difficult to argue that truly inclusive language should be defined by the people who are actually autistic. So there's my first two questions. What kind of autism research gets done, and who gets to decide why and how we talk about autism. But just before we close, I want to talk about one more question, and that's who gets to decide the practices used to intervene with autistic people. And I'm going to give you an example from some research one of my doctoral students did a few years back, and we didn't set out to answer this question at all, but it kind of emerged from our findings. We are actually looking at the friendship experiences of a small group of young people, in fact, in inner city London. So we looked at 12 autistic children and 11 non-autistic classroom peers who were around 11 or 12 years of age. And although it was a small sample, we got a lot of information on these young people. We used questionnaires, interview-based method, and social networking methods with the autistic children themselves, their parents, their teachers, and their non-autistic peers. And one of the things we wanted to know was how included they were in the classrooms. So this is a social network map from one of the classrooms. And this is a slightly unusual classroom because there's actually 3 autistic children in this classroom, but I kind of feel like it reflects the variability there was across the sample. So here you've got, I hope you can see, Caitlin, Zane, and Lucy. And Caitlin and Zane were essentially high-status members of high-status groups. They were pretty well connected to the other children in their class. Lucy, on the other hand, was on the periphery of social networks. She was only connected to one other child in her class. Importantly, she wasn't socially isolated, however. But there was a good deal of variability within this particular classroom, but also across the sample more broadly. Some were highly connected and some were not. And we wanted to try and understand what actually underpinned that variability, and we actually looked at various things like their social reasoning ability, their language skills. None of that kind of explained the variability. But what did explain the variability is children's motivation to establish and maintain their friendships. So this just illustrates, this quote illustrates this variability. So Henry says, sometimes I've got nobody, the 2 boys play with the 2 girls, I try to watch, I want more friends because there are no new people in the class. Only new people be my friend. The other people don't want to be my friend, which is rather heartbreaking. And then we've got James, who says, I'm happy with my life right now. I'm not friendly and talkative, but I'm not friendly. I'm somewhere in the middle. Next, we asked the parents and the teachers about their perceived role in supporting the friendships of these children. And here's what some of them had to say. So one teacher said, if you went out into the playground, he, Stuart, would be on his own more often than not. That would worry me. If I did go onto playground duty, he would be sitting under a tree or just sitting somewhere, so I would go and chat to him and try to get him involved in a game or something. And then we have a teacher about Lucy. So remember that Lucy was the one who was not so connected in her social networks in her class. Teacher says, I say, Lucy, do you want people to like you? She'll say, yes. Do you know how to get people to like you? She says, I've got to be nice to them and let them join in. She wasn't very good at that. She says all the right things, but then you don't see it in practice in the playground. And we also asked parents, who took a somewhat different view from teachers. So this is a parent about Caitlin. So Caitlin was one of the highly connected children. She said, I make sure that almost every music club, basketball, anything that's available, I make sure she gets into it to help her. And church and parties, I try to take her out as much as I can. And then we have Kieran, whose mum said, I just pushed him last year to invite children home to play. And then this year, I thought, no, maybe he don't want to get a friend. I don't know. I can't push him too hard to get a friend. He might be upset, like if I'm saying all the time, oh, haven't you got a friend? Just bullying him all the time. And this last quote brings me to my point. So all the parents and all the teachers expressed a great desire to ensure that their children were fully included in classrooms and enjoyed similar sorts of friendship experiences that non-autistic children do. Because that's what we believe that they should want. But that isn't what Kieran wanted when we asked him. And it's not what Eleanor wanted. This is a parent about Eleanor. She said, I tried doing brownies with her and it was just too painful for her. She had to sit in a circle and talk and she just hated it. And Daniel said, sometimes I just want to play by myself. I hope this example raises what are quite subtle, but I think quite nevertheless critical ethical issues. I think we, as teachers, as parents, as clinicians, as non-autistic people, want autistic children to be part of our social world, and we do as much as we possibly can. So we facilitate interactions in the playground, or we get children into after-school groups to try to increase their social competence. But in doing so, I think we often fail to think about what the child might want him or herself. I think this is a really difficult, there's no straightforward answer to this question, because on the one hand, we want to empower children to be able, if they want to make and keep friends in the future, we want to empower them with those skills. But at the same time, we don't necessarily want to put them in harm. We don't want to, so encouraging children to play with others in a playground might actually make them more anxious and less able to concentrate on schoolwork when they get back into the classroom. Pushing children to go to after-school groups might actually make them more aware of their disability and might compound their anxiety and depression in the longer term. This phenomenon is just an example, but I think it serves to show that we need to be careful about placing our non-autistic ideals and perspectives on autistic children and young people and adults. And I think this goes for all our work, not just in research, but in the clinic as well. And I think it calls into question any certainty we might have about if, when, and how we should intervene. So those are my 3 questions, and I just want to end with a few thoughts about how we might tie it all together and begin to work with autism differently. I'm going to focus on research, but I think what I have to say kind of does relate also to practice. So in other health-related areas of research, or medical research particularly, there's been a huge push to involve patients and the public more in the research process. So that is involving them in the design or the kind of agenda setting or the actual implementation of the research, etc., rather than just being passive subjects. And the idea behind this is if we involve the community in the research process, we should get research that is more thoroughly relevant to patients and communities, that is sufficiently tailored to the realities of their everyday lives, and is more consistent with their values. And so that's research that is carried out with or by community members rather than to, about, or for them. And just to give you a kind of idea of what we mean by this, this is quite an old model of patient involvement. There are much more sophisticated and I think better models, but I think this gives you an idea of what I mean. This is a ladder of participation where the rungs of the ladder, as we go up the ladder, reflect increasing involvement. So at the bottom we have maybe therapy. We've got to the person has no kind of power there. In the middle, we have, consultation. We might ask autistic people about, what our questionnaires look like, or about the kind of questions that we're asking. We might involve parents, etc. That's kind of a consultation. those kinds of consultations and conversations can be tokenistic, because we might disregard whatever they say in the first place. So the green bit at the top is more involvement, and this is where the power between researchers and non-researchers becomes a little bit more equitable. In my centre, I think we're in the middle bit, the yellow bit, and we're trying to move up the ladder into the green bit, but it's really hard, and I think there are a whole range of reasons why it's really hard. But again, you might want to think where you are and where you might want to be. I mean, there are some questions, that I think we need to think about how we might move beyond tokenism. Should we involve the autistic community in all of our research? Is that feasible? Is it appropriate? How do we ensure that the many and often diverse voices are heard in the process, including those who use means of communication other than verbal language? What would and should involvement actually look like? And how do we actually fund such involvement? I think involvement requires lots of time, energy, and also and costs money. I have two concrete suggestions that I actually don't think cost very much money at all. So I'll leave you with these for how we actually might move up the ladder of participation a little bit more. The first is that I think we need and must give autistic children, young people and adults the opportunity to voice their views and perspectives, their wants and needs, their hopes and fears, even for those, and perhaps especially for those, who are less able to communicate themselves so effectively. I think we have to be very careful about placing our non-autistic ideals of what we believe to be the right way of doing things, and we need to listen. And we've heard about Ari Neyman already today, who's an autistic self-advocate who heads up the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and who's a friend of mine, and he says, in the world we live in, disabled people are always just around the corner, but never in the room. So we always talk about disabled people, about autistic people. Very rarely do we talk about them with them. And this includes not just in research, it's also in practice. So my first concrete suggestion is to engage with people. I think, however, we need to do more than just listen. I think we need to connect at a deep and sustainable level. From the young people and adults that I work with, it's clear we need to be much more sensitive to these individuals' capabilities and potential disabilities. Autistic people rightly demand acceptance, respect, and understanding. I think to deepen our ability to respond to their needs, we first of all need to deepen our relationships with them. This means connecting in the clinic, in the home, in school, and in the research lab. And we actually heard some really great examples of this yesterday. Of course, we see autistic people all the time, every day, but how much do we really know about them as people? Their likes and dislikes, what they want out of their own lives. That's what a relationship is. So there are my two suggestions: to engage autistic individuals and to develop relationships with them. Only through developing these relationships can we truly hope to get anything right. When I started doing this work a few years ago, discussions and debates around involving autistic people in conversations about them were incredibly rare. And as some of you may have noticed, particularly from Steve Silverman's talk yesterday, things are beginning to change. So Steve's book, but also Andrew Solomon's book, Far From the Tree, have caused a huge storm across the world. And it seems as if we truly are at the beginning of thinking about autism differently and thinking about working with autism differently. But as ever, I don't think change really comes from academics and intellectuals. It comes from the people willing to work together to make their voices heard. In the US, we've had almost 10 years of activism from the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. And as researchers and clinicians and educators, I think we need to do what we can to stand together and support their cause wherever we may be in the world. And so by doing so, I really think we can transform the future of autism research and ultimately the future lives of autistic people and their families. And thank you very much.